Roundtable. I'm here with our lead designer, Tim Stelmach, Will Teixeira, and our lead engineer and our designer, Chris Siegel, who will be swapping in with me momentarily. As you know...
Who are you?
I'm Joe Fielder, the director and writer of Underworld Ascendant. As you know, the developer roundtables are normally an exclusive for people who have backed the digital protagonist level and above, but we decided to make this first one free to everybody as special thanks for all of your support. We'll have future ones details about future episodes in the future. Today's topics include combat, stealth, and magic. And you've gotten a chance to see a little bit of our pre-alpha, or even had a chance to play it yourself. So what Tim, Chris, and Will are going to be talking about today is the philosophy, the goals behind combat, stealth, and magic, and what the next steps are going to be. And then a little bit later on, we're going to be taking some questions. So I'm going to tag team with Chris. You guys want to start off with talking about combat?
Sure. Well, for starters, just to put this in context of the build that we released last week, I'm going to assume that if not everyone watching us now has played that build, that many of you have, and that at least enough of you have that your side of the conversation will be informed by that. So, what was in that build? The main objective there was really for purposes of some playtests that we were having, and also for communication with our development partners. Other news that we'll talk about more in not here, but to represent what were the play styles that we were going to be trying to primarily support for Underworld Ascendant, so because of that, there's some things that were informed by the desire to contrast those styles, right? In particular, like if you look at the very beginning of that experience where you're making your choices about skills and weapons and wands and stuff, it's not representative of the final game that a sword is equivalent to a skill in the way that you build your character. But that's the way we did it for purposes of this illustrative exercise, just to be clear, like what people were even seeing there. So that's true with the sword and the bow and everything. It's true in the context of the other styles as well, but just setting up where we are and where we're going with combat, that should be mentioned about like what is and isn't representative in terms of the build that we've just released. So as far as that goes, we were trying to draw this illustration of these different styles that we support, and one of those we were basically trying to stand up just the basics of the way that we expected hand-to-hand combat to go. So I think the best way to describe that there's some design goals there in terms of style. Mainly for us, it has to do with the player's relationship with the terrain and with movement. One thing that I see as a risk in melee combat in first-person games is in some games you just end up with people like standing there hacking at each other, and it doesn't really matter that you're in a first-person game. The terrain doesn't matter. You're not engaged with the world anymore when you're engaged with an enemy, and that's something we very much wanted to avoid. And our strategy for that is all of our combat design decisions are being driven by this goal of involving maneuver. Either the way that you move affects the combat moves that you're going to execute, or movement becomes an output of the combat system in the cases where we have like knockback and knockdown effects. We want to keep the combatants moving over the terrain so that your choices from moment to moment will vary, and emergent effects will also happen, right? Like we want there to be side effects where the combat like roams into an area, and there's collateral damage as you like swing into an object that maybe you're nearby. You've probably had a chance to see the way that a lot of the gameplay in that demo is driven by physics, right down to, like throwing a lever. If you like throw an object at that lever, it will tip over and it will actuate the effect of the lever, right? Which is, you don't actually have to like walk up and use the lever, right? And that's very intentional as well.
Yeah, even the blocking is actually, it tries to get players to move around more, because we could have put in a block where you just hold down the button and it negates damage and you can stand there and nothing else happens and you can stand there and block forever. Instead we put in a parry, and so the way the parry works is hitting the parry button in a proper alignment and looking at the enemy. When it comes at you, both of you get knocked back. So where you are in the world matters. So basically, if you're stuck on the edge of a cliff fighting someone and you do a parry, that's a mistake that you just made. So you need to be aware of a little bit of what's behind you and what's going on around you.
Yeah.
So the parry doesn't. It takes us away from the just hack and stand there / combat.
Yeah, that's a great example of it was kind of abstractly I said, that we want you have to either maneuver in order to execute a move or as a consequence of the move. But that's that is a really excellent example to illustrate that. And actually, Chris has been since we put that version in the can, has been working further on a lot of our melee combat maneuvers. I wonder if you have anything to add about all this.
So, I mean, we did a lot of research, everything from the Assassin's Creed games to Far Cry to Dark Messiah to Princess Bride. True.
That one girl is really.
And what's the one that you love there?
Bloodborne.
Bloodborne, which I always forget the name of.
Yeah.
And some of the things that we decided were really important was because the combat speed is not wacky. It's it's a little bit more precise. We needed to make sure that the bad guys' big abilities were, they had good tells on them, and Bloodborne is, basically best of show at that. For the player skills, we've kind of went back and forth over the past year and a half on where we should land, and really I think we kind of landed almost back where we started, which is Dark Messiah, right? Because they sort of has everything that we need. It doesn't take over the game. Because we're not making just a combat simulator or just a stealth game or just a magic game. So it's like we can't just throw all our eggs into that single basket.
Right. But that's one that a lot of our fans on the forums pointed us at specifically, and there's a lot there that they valued. Right. And it's not without its rough edges either in some respects, and it's not exactly our game, but it's in terms of the player's relationship with the environment and the motion of the combatants being such a strong focus.
Right. There won't be bedposts of spikes all over the level.
The spiky bedposts.
Sorry if ananybody was hoping for that, but even to this day, I don't understand that design decision.
Why do we even have one of those?
Yeah. Fun, but who put these on the wall, man?
You have to play that game to understand what we're talking about, but it's
the bed spikes. There is an amazing thing about them, though, is that our particular goal with combat is to have players know about the environment and have the environment actually be a factor in that, and that's something that Dark Messiah really touched into. It was part of the kicking. So the kicking McBoots is you press. There's a dedicated kick button.
I know that kick maneuver, it threatens to take over the game at certain phases of the game, which is a problem. But it certainly does the job in terms of.
And then they had to design out of it because later in the game they realized, oh no, we made this kick wicked powerful, and so all of a sudden all the enemies are like, no, you can't kick me.
But it is great because you have to position yourself correctly.
Absolutely.
So you're playing this maneuver game where you're putting yourself into the right position for that maneuver, which is. It's a golden moment, I think, in that game.
Sure.
Yep.
Is the kicking.
Yeah.
One thing that might be worth talking about is that there aren't necessarily dedicated character classes.
Oh, well, yeah. I don't know if... Joe, are you mic'd over there? Are people hearing you?
You should be able to hear.
Okay.
Maybe.
Having mentioned the topic of these play styles that we're trying to illustrate, it's important to note that there's a fourth goal there, right? Like there's this whole set of goals that like each of these styles be well supported, but there's this additional goal that like that you not be locked into a particular one of them as the only effective way to play the game, right? That like you should be able to mix and match either like in terms of trying to find effective tactical combinations of different things to like come up with a character build that is effective, or just as an expressive choice, right? Where like if you're one thing we definitely wanted to look out for is it coming across as character classes, right? Where your choices are predetermined from the point where you've made your initial decision about what path to go down. That's to me far less interesting than one where you can pick and choose either as a tactical or a sort of stylistic approach to the game.
Back in when we were on DDO a million years ago.
So that's Dungeons and Dragons Online.
I'm sorry, Dungeons and Dragons Online.
These guys come out of that environment here.
I think one of the shining things that we did on that game was allow exactly that, is that you could just mix and match the trees to your heart's content and either make something really cool or something completely terrible. Hopefully we don't have the completely terrible part, but there will probably most likely be combinations across these skills that are gonna work really well together.
And I think that is one thing that in addition to illustrating the sort of archetypical play styles, one thing that we saw definitely coming out of our play tests was that there were effective combinations even in the set of things that we included in here. Where just a couple of simple like examples. Like the slow time spell is good for like practically anybody's style. It can make you like much more agile in your maneuvers in a melee, right, where you can like really maneuver around a guy with a lot easier. But also when it comes down to dealing with traps, right, like there's a lot of those traps like really emphasizes like the movement and timing, and so slow time really shines there. And so there. And I could come up with other examples, but the point is made. I think. So
before we dig into stealth, do you want to talk about next steps in combat, or maybe even a little preview about some of the combat skills? Or?
Sure. Next steps in combat. A lot of this. We're still developing our ideas here, and that's obviously a big part of the reason for having. These roundtables now, but generally speaking, like it all is rooted in what I was saying about our design goals for the combat style, right? This style that emphasizes maneuver and mobility, and so the next step for us, we're digging down in terms of the player's combat moves and attack animations and such. All of which Chris is developing along with our animators, and the goal there again is to have a variety of interesting moves, to have the decisions about those moves be dependent on changing circumstances in time and space, right? So that you're making these little moment to moment improvisatory decisions. So it isn't static. So it does try to cleave to some of those best practices examples that we were talking about, or like the kinds of movies even that we like the combat style. So
one of the things that Tim and I have been talking about for years is that we would rather our combat guys not be your typical knight in armor.
Oh
dude,
gosh, yeah.
Right.
I take that for granted so much at this point, but it really has to be said.
Definitely, we're looking far more at the Jackie Chans of the world and Wushu. So a lot of the fighter tree, combat tree, whatever we end up calling it, or motion-based skills, the wall runs and all that are in there.
Mm-hmm.
and most of the combat styles, as an after effect of not only doing damage, they usually have a knockback or a knockdown or some way of